If we can't change the past or the laws of nature, do we really have a choice about the future? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Recently, we've been talking about the difference between compatibilism and incompatibilism. Remember, compatibilism is the idea that free will and determinism are both compatible with each other. Determinism, remember, is that everything that happens is determined to happen the way that it does. So there's no choice about the matter. It must happen the way that it happens. And especially when talking about free will, we're talking about our actions. Our actions have to happen the way that they happen, and there are no two ways about it. Now, incompatibilism is the rejection of that claim. Today, we're going to look at an argument for incompatibilism that's been a very powerful argument. It's called the consequence argument. So this is definitely one that is been gone through in the literature for many a year, and so you definitely should know this one. It was originally given by a philosopher, Carl Gannett, and but the most cited version, or the most useful version, was given by Peter von Inwagen, and so that's the one that we're going to look at today. So the difficulty about giving this argument that Peter van Inwagen gives is that it is highly technical, and you can give it in a very non-technical way, but the debate has become so intense that like the technical way of giving it has become pretty important, and it uses not only propositional logic, which I have an entire course on, so you could check that out, but it also uses modal logic, which I have plans eventually to get to a modal logic course, so maybe one day, but I don't have that up just yet, so I don't know. So I'm going to have to try to explain a little bit about modal logic today, as well as explaining this argument, which is, I don't know, a tall task. So let's get into the argument. So the interesting thing about this is it starts off with two rules of inference. So it doesn't start off with the argument itself. It starts off by looking at, by giving two rules of ways of inferring things. And the first rule von Inwagen gives is called Rule Alpha. And it looks like this. Necessarily P entails NP. And necessarily P, so it's box P entails NP. Box P is part of modal logic. It means necessarily. So, and P stands for some proposition, any proposition. So P could be, what do I have? 2 plus 2 equals 4. So it's necessarily the case, that's what the box means. It's necessarily the case that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That means it has to be the case that 2 plus 2 equals 4. There's no possible world in which 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. That's what that box means. And then you have that little turnstile, that means entails. So that's like saying therefore. So necessarily P, therefore NP. Now this capital N is going to stand for, in this argument, is going to stand for, according to, it's an operator that von Inwagen uses, that he uses to mean P, and no one has or ever has had a choice about P. So if it's necessarily the case that 2 plus 2 equals 4, then this would entail that NP, where NP means 2 plus 2 equals 4, and no one has ever had or ever has right now a choice about whether 2 plus 2 equals 4. So that is von Inwagen's operator N. In other philosophers have tweaked what N could mean. And for example, in Michael McKenna and Derk Pereboom's book, they change it to mean no one has any power over the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So it's a powerlessness operator, they call it. That might be a little more useful way of doing this, but von Inwagen says choice. So that's the one we'll go with today. So that's rule alpha. The next rule of inference is rule beta. And rule beta looks like this. NP, N, if P then Q, entails NQ. Now, without the little n's in front of these different propositions, this thing is going to make total sense. This is going to be what's called a modus ponens in propositional logic. So if you say, if P then Q, P therefore Q, what you're saying is, if you have P, then you have to have Q. You have P, therefore what? You have to have Q, right? That's what it says. So a modus ponens makes obvious sense. The question is, does it make sense when we put the little n's in front of it? Remember, the little n's mean that thing is true and no one has ever had or does have a choice now about whether or not it's true. And von Inwagen is going to say in this rule beta, yes, this does make this is a correct rule of inference for his argument, and we can give an example, and hopefully this will show why he would think that this was a legitimate rule of inference. So the example would be N, the sun explodes in the year 2000. N, if the sun explodes in the year 2000, then all life on Earth ends in the year 2000. Therefore, N, all life on Earth ends in the year 2000. So the N's mean doesn't have a choice or never had a choice about. So the sun explodes in the year 2000 and no one has ever had a choice about whether the sun explodes in the year 2000, let's say, right? That's the first premise. No one has a choice about whether or not if the sun explodes in the year 2000, then all life ends on Earth in the year 2000, right? So no one has a choice about that, about whether or not that's going to happen, or whether or not that's true. So therefore, no one has a choice about whether or not all life on Earth ends in the year 2000. That kind of makes sense? So that's his rule. So those are von Inwagen's two rules of inference. Now let's go ahead and look at his argument. Premise one, necessarily if H and L, then P. So here, H, L, and P all mean something. So H is a proposition about the total state of the world at some time in the distant past before any agents existed. So that means, like, before humans were on the scene, describe the world and throw it all into one conjunction. You know, like there was land masses and there were plants and there were, like, put that all together into one conjunction. And then L stands for all the laws of nature. So force equals mass times acceleration, and E equals mc squared, and then throw all of those laws all together into one big conjunction. So you put those two together into a conjunction, and the P is some proposition that's true after all that distant past. So let's say the New Orleans Saints won Super Bowl 44. So this premise one is the statement of determinism. This is what determinism basically means, that it's necessarily the case that if you have the past set up in a certain way and the laws of nature also being what they are, they will lead to necessarily the New Orleans Saints winning Super Bowl 44, right? It has to happen that way. There's no two ways about it. So, and P can stand for whatever you want. I went surfing yesterday at, like 2:00, something like that. Like it could stand for that. So any kind of, anything that has happened, including free will choices. I chose to go surfing yesterday at 2:00. So determinism means based on the past and the laws of nature, it's necessarily the case that I went surfing yesterday at 2:00. Premise two, with a little logic razzle dazzle, you can change premise one into necessarily if H, then if L, then P. So what this basically, I won't actually do the logic. If you're interested, check out my propositional logic course. But ignore the boxes for right now, and just think about the if H and L, then P in premise one. And what would you have like? Think about it this way. It's true that if you have H and L, then P. What would happen if you have H? Well, if you had L, then you would have P, right? Because you need to have both H and L, and then you would have P. Well, that's what premise two says. If you have H, well, then if you also have L, then you would have P. So intuitively speaking, premise one is the same thing as premise two, or it entails premise two. So that's two. You get two from one by modal and sentential logic. Three, you change the box to an N by rule alpha. Remember, rule alpha, if you have box P, that entails NP. Here we have box if H then L, if L then P. So we have also N if H then if L then P. And then 4, NH. So that is, remember, N stands for nobody has a choice or ever had a choice about. So an H was the past, that description of the past before any agent existed. So this is a premise that we are just assuming. And we're assuming that nobody has ever had a choice about the past. So this premise we'll call the fixity of the past premise. The past is fixed and there's nothing you can do about it. And that seems pretty obvious. 5, N if L then P. And we get this from 4 and 3 by rule beta. So this was a modus ponens, right? And you have H and you have, forget the N's for a second. You have H and then you have if H then, if L then P. Therefore you have if L then P, right? That's what that says. And then just throw the N's back on there in the front. And that's what rule beta says, is that it all works with N's in the front too. And then NL. So NL is another thing that we're going to assume, that nobody has a choice or ever had a choice about the laws of nature. So this is a rule we'll call the fixity of the laws. So no one's ever had a choice about the laws of nature. And then given 6 and 5 and rule beta, again, we can get NP. So again, forget the N's for a second. You have L, you have if L then P, so therefore you're going to have P, right? And that's just the modus ponens. And then throw the N's back in the front, and you have rule beta, and then there you go with NP. So NP means no one has or ever has had a choice about whether or not the Saints won the Super Bowl 44. I went surfing yesterday at 2 p.m., right? And that determined it. So we started off by assuming, remember, premise one is determinism. We're assuming determinism is true. Premises 4 and 6 assume the fixity of the past and the fixity of the laws of nature. So assuming those three things, we show that that nobody ever has a choice about anything, including the fact that I go to surfing at 2 p.m. yesterday. I had no choice about that. I had to take the egg out. I got smacked, by the way. Bad choice. I should have taken my shortboard, and it was a little big, and the egg was a bad choice. So that is the consequence argument, and it sounds like a pretty solid case against compatibilism. If we assume determinism and the fixity of the past and the fixity of the laws of nature, then it seems like we have no choices, right? It seems like we have no free will. The laws of nature and the past, those seems pretty fixed. So it's just determinism that we need to get rid of in order to have some kind of choice. So that seems like a pretty big argument against compatibilism. Except that's not the only thing that we assumed, right? We also assumed rule alpha and rule beta. We assumed those rules of inference. And at the time, they seemed pretty innocuous. Rule alpha definitely is, but rule beta is one that has come under fire and, in fact, has been rejected even by Peter von Inwagen. So let's look at that right now. And if you thought that the logic was done, unfortunately, I'm sorry, but we're not quite finished just yet. And that's because rule beta, the rule of inference rule beta, entails what's called agglomerativity. And here's what agglomerativity is. Typically, when you have you have two propositions, they can be put together into a conjunction. So if you have P and you also have Q, you can put them together in P and Q. So like, let's say you have P is roses are red, Q is violets are blue. You can say roses are red and violets are blue, and that's a true proposition. Now, if you throw N's in front of those things, you can throw those into a conjunction too. NP and NQ. But what you can't do is to throw the P and the Q into a conjunction with the N outside. You can't say NP, NQ entails N, P, and Q. That's agglomerativity. And that is an invalid entailment. So first let's show how how rule beta leads to agglomerativity, and then we'll show how that's invalid. So first we'll assume NP we'll provisionally assume NP, right? Just assume for the argument. And then assume for the argument NQ. Provisionally assume NQ. Necessarily, it's the case that if P, then if Q, then P and Q. Now, why is this true? It's true because the 3 is a truth of logic. So it's tautological. So we don't have to actually prove it. But here's what it says. Necessarily, if P, then if Q, then P and Q. So why is that the case? Because no truth assignment makes if P, then if Q, then P and Q false. So what do I mean by that? And I can't. I mean, if this were a much longer video, I would show you truth trees or truth tables or something like that, and show you how this is the case. But let's try to do this in an intuitive sense. So what this says is, if you have P, then if you have Q, well, you're going to have both P and Q, right? Makes sense, right? If you have one thing, then if you have the other thing, then you're going to have both of those things. So that is something that has to be the case, right? So that's necessarily true. So premise 3 is something that is tautological. It's just a truth of logic. Like you don't have to prove it. It's just always going to be true. So that's not something we're assuming. That's just something that's true. And then using rule alpha on premise 3, we just change that box into an n. So we have n if p, then if q, then p and q. And remember, we assumed way back up at premise 1, np. So now we have np, we have n if p, then if q, then if p, then p, then q. So using rule beta, we would get 5 if q, then p and q, right? Forget the n's for a second, and you have p, you have if p, then if q, then p and q. Well, then you have if q, then p and q. That's what that says, and then throw the n in front again. And then back at premise 2, we assumed nq. So now we have, using rule beta again, n, p, and q. But wait a second, n, p, and q, that's the thing that we wanted to avoid, right? We assume np, we assume nq, that entails n, p, and q. And that's because we were using rule beta. And we did use rule alpha as well, by the way, but rule alpha is not the one that's at fault here. It's rule beta. So this is a proof that rule beta leads us to agglomerativity. So what's so bad about agglomerativity? Let's say you are flipping a coin, and P stands for the coin does not land heads, and Q stands for the coin does not land tails. NP is true, right? You have no choice about whether or not the thing is not going to land heads, right? Like, in other words, it's going to land tails. You have no choice about whether or not it's not going to land heads. And Q is also true. You have no choice about whether or not it's not going to land tails. But N, P, and Q is not true. You do have a choice about whether it's not going to both either not land heads and not land tails, because if you flip the coin, it's going to do one or the other, right? So N, P, and Q is false because all you have to do is flip a coin, whereas each individual proposition is true because you have no choice about whether it's going to be one or the other, not heads or not tails. So agglomerativity is not valid. So this is definitely devastating for the argument, and Peter van Inwagen admitted it. However, he thought of some adjustments that could be made, and these adjustments would save the argument. So the first thing, you could replace n with n star. Remember, n was no one has ever had or ever has a choice about whether or not p is true. Replace that with n star p, where that stands for p, and no one can or ever could do anything such that if she did it, p might be false. So that's more like the powerlessness thing, right? So that actually avoids the agglomerativity problem if you replace the n with n star. Also, you can replace beta with rule beta 2, or I've also heard it called rule box beta. And it goes like this: NP, and then box if P then Q entails NQ. So instead of saying NP, N if P then Q entails NQ, you replace that N if P then Q with box if P then Q. And that also avoids having the same issue. So you can do either one of those two things and you save the argument. So it looks like we still have the same problem. What can be done for the compatibilists? So if we're not going to reject rule beta then, and rule alpha is pretty innocuous, then what can we do? Because determinism is, remember, not what we want to reject if you're a compatibilist. So we want to leave that intact. Then the only other things to reject are the fixity of the past or the fixity of the laws of nature. That seemed like a big deal. Is that possible? Well, philosopher David Lewis, actually thinks that we can. And he thinks he can make sense out of that. So here's how he does that. This would be called local miracle compatibilism. The first thing that he does is to change this argument of von Inwagen's into a counterfactual version. So he looks at the consequence argument as a reductio ad absurdum. And what that means is it's something that you assume something to show that that thing is absurd, right? And he wants to show that this is not the case, that it doesn't reduce to something absurd. So here's how he does so. Premise 1, provisionally assume that determinism is true. So this is how a reductio works. You assume something is true, and you show that it results in something absurd, and you say, oh, well, that thing I assumed must be false then. So assume that determinism is true. Premise 2, I did not raise my hand, let's say at the department meeting to vote on that proposal. But I had the ability to do so. Premise 3, if I had raised my hand, then either the remote past would have been different or the laws of physics would have been different. 4, if 3 were the case, if I had raised my hand, and then the remote past would have been different and the laws of physics would have been different, then C2 would be true. And C2 is this. If I had raised my hand, I would thereby have caused the laws or the past to be different, right? I would have caused the laws of nature or the past to be different. And if C2 is true, then A2 is true, where A2 is, I had the ability to do something, like raise my hand, such that if I had exercised my ability, I would thereby have caused the laws or the past to be different. 6, A2 asserts an incredible ability, something that you can't believe, right? That you can change the laws of nature, or you can change the past. That seems absurd. Not one. So it must be the case that determinism is false. If we assume that determinism is true, that leads to the possibility that I could change the past or I could change the laws of nature. That seems crazy. So the argument says you should reject determinism. That's his version of the consequence argument. Now, David Lewis is a compatibilist. So he's giving this version of the argument because he's going to say that there's something wrong with it. And what's wrong with it is that there is a conflation here in C2 and A2. So instead of C2, he would give C1. If I had raised my hand, the laws or the past would have been different. Not that I would have caused them to be different, just it would have been the fact. It would have been it would have been the case that they just would have been different. And A1, that would entail A1. I had the ability to do something, like raise my hand, such that if I had exercised my ability, the laws of the past would have been different. Not that I would have caused them to be different, just they would have been different. So I guess one additional thing that you should know about this is, because it sounds kind of crazy when you hear the laws of nature would have been different. What he's talking about here, he has a Humean view of laws of nature, where laws of nature aren't things set in stone that force you to do this. Like gravity isn't like a thing that forces you to fall down. It's the description of what regularly happens, right? So we have mathematical descriptions of things that just happen to happen the same way over and over again. So if you like just didn't fall that way, we would have a different mathematical equation. That's the idea, right? So there is no force of gravity. There is just a regularity. There is just you regularly fall the same way every single time. And there would be nothing crazy about you not falling that way one time or many times, or like you just would have a different regularity. So on that view, if you had raised your hand, then the regularities would have just been a little bit different. Or if you had raised your hand, then the past that led up to you raising your hand would have been a little bit different. One or the other would have happened. But it's not that you would have caused it. It's just that that would have been the case. That's what he's saying. So that's his compatibilist response. So to be honest, I'm not totally sure how I feel about the response here. And the reason is because at the moment that you do that, I definitely don't believe in a Humean view of the laws of nature. But I'm not sure that you need that. But still, I just, it's at the moment that you're about to do it, it's not like you have the ability to do one thing or another. It's the past and the laws of nature could have been different. Okay, but do I have the free will? That's the question. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. And we'll stick around for the next video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share this video. And I'll see you in the next video. All right, adios.